Good morning. We are in the midst of studying the parsha called Balak, Chukas, and after the story or the discussion of the red heifer, the female cow that was used in order to purify all those who would be contaminated by contact with the dead. Torah goes on to describe what happened afterwards, after this commandment, that Miriam, Moshe and Aaron's sister, died, and there was no water, showing that the water that had been given miraculously for 40 years was in the merit of this holy woman. When she died, the water ceased. And the people attacked Moses and Aaron verbally, despite the fact they had just lost their sister. What are you doing sitting around, doing nothing? We are thirsty. It's hot. It's 100 degrees in the shade. We need water. We're going to die if you don't do anything. And Moshe Rabbeinu was instructed by God to take his staff of leadership, that indicated leadership, but to go and to speak to the rock from which water would flow. And Moshe Rabbeinu, in the process, there was an exchange between the people. They were just like today. Yesterday, there were hecklers. The Democrats heckled the president. So people thought that they were of the caliber that could heckle Moshe Rabbeinu. And this was too much for Moshe. Not because he was insulted, but because of the whole attitude that people had. They deserved everything. They failed to realize everything was from God. And the minute they were lacking something, they felt overwhelmed and needed a fix that was immediate. They couldn't rely that God would help them. And in almost 40 years since he had begun educating them, he still hadn't gotten them to the point where, yes, things had to be done when they were difficult, but you didn't have to lose your mind over it. You had to figure out what you needed to do. Maybe you needed to pray more. Maybe you needed to study more Torah. The whole apparatus that they got their needs immediately, when they wanted it, when they needed it, was taken out of context. Instead of realizing that God had provided for them in order that they could advance their spiritual state, they could study, they could pray, they could deal in acts of loving kindness without any difficulty. Instead of understanding that the purpose of all of that was for them to grow spiritually, they thought that they were deserving of everything. And when something didn't exist, something was wrong. Something was wrong. Obviously, something was wrong with Moses. He should have made sure that they had their needs. And Moshe Rabbeinu, they were so insolent. He had just sat down to sit shiva for his sister. And now they were badgering him. They were attacking him mercilessly, without any sense of respect for an elder, for a prophet, for someone who would be the Torah giver for all generations. They had no sense of kavod. They were on the same level as Moses, they thought. And it's interesting, the parallels between what happened yesterday and what happens in the parsha yesterday. This is what happens. They behave insolently, and they think themselves the equal of Moses, that they can go ahead and criticize him, belittle him. And so Moshe Rabbeinu, his anger is not for himself. His anger is this what I've done for 40 years? Is this how I've created a group of people who have no sense of thankfulness, no sense of propriety, no sense of shame. And in the process, Moshe Rabbeinu hit the rock. Why the rock? Instead of lashing out at the people, he hit the rock symbolically that they deserved to be hit over the head for their attitude, for their chutzpah, for their anger, for their arrogance and critique of others. Moshe was justified. The problem was perception. And because of perception, that Moshe Rabbeinu didn't care about their suffering, Moshe Rabbeinu could not lead them to the promised land. Joshua had to lead them to the promised land. Not because Joshua deserved it, or that Moshe Rabbeinu deserved the punishment. Moshe Rabbeinu could not lead this group of people. This group of people who were cajoled, who basically were treated like little children and given everything they wanted and everything they needed, when they wanted it, when they needed it. Moshe Rabbeinu could no longer be their teacher because he had shown them a side that they couldn't appreciate. When you see a teacher who is a great man, and the teacher demands from you the standards that he lives by, so if you are of a high caliber person, ultimately you appreciate that. He's demanding from you the excellence that he demands from himself. But if you're not on that level, all you see is an angry, frustrated man who always says no. You can't appreciate a child who has needs and desires. And they label the teacher as cruel and harsh. Is the label accurate? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. For you see, a teacher always measures people by themselves. It's a very rare teacher who measures people by themselves and sees how they are. Moses, in his humility, thought that everyone could be just like him. In fact, they could have been, had they wanted to. But their perspective, where their mind was, where their comfort zone was nothing like him. Moses understood the coddled life. He had been a prince in Egypt. All of his desires and needs were given to him by his doting stepmother, Bitya, the daughter of Pharaoh. And he gave it all up. Gave it all up to go wandering from place to survive, because he wanted to stand up for his people Israel. So Moses understood being coddled, having everything you wanted when you wanted it. He gave that up for a higher cause and thought everyone can do this, everyone should do that. But not everyone wants to do that, and because they don't want to do that, they can't do it. And therefore, some people interpret this as Moses sinned by not speaking to the rock. No, Moses did not sin by not speaking to the rock. Moses hit the rock as an act of teaching, showing that the children of Israel deserved to be punished for their obstinacy, being obstinate, for being cruel, for having no care for others. Moses was a human being as well. And he was their leader, their king. And you had to have greater respect for a king and a teacher. They lost it for that moment, but that showed a lack of respect, a lack of character, which is very, very hard not to see. They didn't see it. He was trying to point that out to them. So Moses did nothing wrong. But by doing so, it was a mismatch. His expectations of character, of self-sacrifice, of giving up the codled life, giving it up completely, missed the mark of that generation. That generation wasn't able to be on his level. He was no longer going to be the leader of that generation. A generation needs a leader similar to them, above them, but similar to them. And that's why Joshua, who was on a step below Moshe Rabbeinu, could be their leader. But Moses already was beyond them. And that's why Moses couldn't enter the land. Not because he sinned, but because there was no one to really talk to. Because the way he saw the potential of people was beyond their imagination. It's too bad for us. All what would have been had Moshe Rabbeinu came into the land with us and led us, and we would have allowed him to bring up our potential to be similar to him. What a different world it would have been.